Alright, so this is where we left off last time. We were able to submit a form to our new route and to output all the data that was sent. So now in this video, you will see how you can validate this data to make sure that everything is what you expect and that the data is correct and that the data adheres to some kind of set of rules that you define. And then we will see how to store data inside the database using eloquent models. So let's jump right into the code. So we don't really need this line anymore. First, let's see how can we validate the data. So data is available inside this request object and will associate the result of validation to a new variable data. And if you do request validate and using an array you specify some fields and the validation rules, this resulting data would be an array with only the fields that you have specified, and this would only work if the validation will pass. Alright, so let's define some validation rules. So this is done by specifying the name of the fields of the form. So we've got title, and that would be the key, and the value would be the set of the validation rules. So I can say that it is required, and we use this pipe character to separate the rules, as you can define more than one. So let's say the length should be maximum 255 characters. Then we know that we've got description and it is required. Let me copy that one to also add a validation rule for the long description. Alright, this way you get the validated data. And now how it works. So when you call this request validate method, it will use all the data that was sent through the form to validate it, and it will use those keys from this validate array, from this array passed to validate, to check those fields against those specific validation rules. Now, if everything passes, you just get a data array with title, description, and long description values sent through the form. Otherwise, automatically what will happen is Laravel will redirect the user back to the last page, and it will set a session variable called errors. So sessions basically is the current user session data that is kept separately for every user, and this session data will contain all the errors from this validation. So then you can, for example, display those errors next to the form inputs. Alright, but for now let's assume that everything went fine and that we've got the correct data. The next thing we will be doing at this point is we will create a new task. So let's do app models task. Now also at this point it's possible that we just import this task model. So we don't really need to specify the fully qualified class name. Instead, we have added this task class here using the use statement, so we can just use the class name. So we create a new model and we will be setting the task properties one by one. So the title would be data title. The task description would be the, can't hit the right character, sorry, not task, but data description. And the same with the long description. So that's task long description, data task long description. And finally, this creates just a new class. That's a model that exists in the memory, but it's not saved anywhere. You need to call the model save method to save changes to the database. So Laravel is smart enough that you can work with models that are loaded from the database, And then calling save would instead run an update query. But if Laravel knows that you have created a new model, it will know that when you save, it needs to run an insert query. Finally, we should redirect to some other page. Typically, you do that together with a short message that you display only once, but I will talk about that later on. So let's redirect to some route, maybe to the newly added task. So we will redirect to this task show route and we will use the newly saved task ID. All right, so that's the implementation. Now let's see if everything works. So let's go to this URL and yes, so first we need to go to the form. Let me type something very quickly and add a task. That's a brand new task, XXX, that's my current date and time. And we can also check the database that indeed it was just stored. All right. Alright, so this is how it looks like when everything goes fine. Now let's also see what happens when we've got validation errors and how they are handled. We won't be handling them just yet, just want to show you how the validation works. So for that, let's open this create blade PHP form. And at the beginning of the section content, let's render the value of the special errors variable that Laravel makes available to all views, so it doesn't have to be passed from any routes. And let's see what it contains. Refresh this page and you should see an array here, an empty array, but if you submit this form without specifying any fields, you might have not noticed that, but we were instantly redirected back from this route back to the form with all the errors set into the session. Thus, this errors variable was populated. So you see that for every single form input or form key, you've got an array with the text of all the errors, like that this is required, that well, this would contain all the possible errors with all the validation constraints that didn't pass. So there are some ways that this can be handled pretty neatly in Laravel Blade templates, but that's a topic we'll be handling a little later. Now, it's also important to stress how important the data validation is in the web development. And it's pretty great that Laravel provides those validation tools out of the box, and it is so easy to validate all the input coming from the user. So I would stress us again that it's very important that you always validate the user input. So you should never trust the user input and just store it immediately inside the database. You always should, it's called sanitize, and validate the data that users send to your application. Alright, so that's everything. Next up, we are gonna see how to work with those validation errors, how to display them. I will also show you a way how you can make this code a little shorter. And then we will also talk about the so-called flash messages, which are just one-time messages you display to the users when something happens inside the app.